When you're working as a salesperson, you usually have a lot that you want to talk about. And the challenge is that you only have a limited amount of time and attention to work with. But here's a trick. Instead of talking about your product and what it does, share customer examples. Examples of customers are extremely efficient and effective at explaining what it is you sell, how it works, and why a prospect should buy from you. And in this video, we're going to explain how you can do this for your product or service. Hello, it is Michael Halper with Sales Scripter, and this is Module 5 in the Smart Sales System. And this actually brings us to the last step of our sales message brainstorming process, where we will show you how to create very clear and concise customer examples for your product or service. And we're able to do that because we've created a template that you can very easily insert a few details to create very clear and powerful customer examples. And all you have to do is answer 5 questions. And the first question is simply identifying the name or the customer that you want to create an example for. And by the way, if you have a customer example that you want to share, but you don't feel comfortable sharing the name of that customer, you can simply use a descriptive label. And the second thing to identify is, if possible, try to think about a problem that customer had before working with you or before buying your product, or maybe a problem they had that motivated them to either come to you or to buy the product or service you sell. And if you can't think of anything offhand, you might want to go back to the pain points step of the sales message brainstorming process, where we created a list of pain points. Because if we created a good list of pain points for your product or service, there's a very good chance that the customer you're creating an example for may have had one of those pain points. The third item to identify is the product or service you sold them. And the fourth item is to try to think of an initial improvement that your product or service delivered to this customer. And again, if you can't think of anything off the top of your mind, you might want to go back to the value step of the sales message brainstorming process. And there's a good chance that if we created a good list of improvements your product or service delivers, then it could very easily be the case that one of those improvements was an improvement delivered to this customer. And the fifth item is to try to think of a second improvement or an ultimate improvement that your product or service created for this customer. And if you can see here what we're doing at the end here with steps 4 and 5, we're basically creating 2 improvements. And what we're trying to do here is to tell a good story. And the way we approach that is to have 2 improvements, basically creating one and that led to another. And a good way to do that is for one of those to be a technical improvement, like improving a process, making something work better. And then the second improvement, or the ultimate improvement, is a business improvement, so a decrease in costs or an increase in income or increase in revenue. So here's an example of going through those 5 steps and filling those in for our demonstration product of web design services. And when you're creating a customer example for your product or service, it can be good to keep in mind the target audience, because then you can share examples that are close to the target audience that you're communicating with. This is optional. You could just create a standard customer example that you use for everybody. But if your target audience is plumbers, and you can create an example of selling your product or service to another plumber, then that makes your customer example and your sales message more powerful and something that the prospect might understand and relate to better. But once you have these 5 answers filled in for your sales message, what we can do is we can use those to populate customer example templates. I'm going to actually give you 2 customer example templates. I'm going to give you a long version and a short version. And the long version basically goes something like this. I'm going to fill this in with the demonstration product, but I'll just put the template on the screen. But the long version is, we worked with SmileBright, and they were having a challenge of needing to get more traffic to their website. We helped to solve that with our SEO services. We basically helped to increase their website traffic by 40%. And that ultimately led to an increase in new patients by 15%. And the short version of that goes something like this. We recently worked with SmileBright, and we helped them to increase their website traffic by 40%. And that ultimately led to an increase in new patients by 15%. What we're removing from that version is basically the pain point the customer had and the product we sold them. And I can show you how you can use those templates starting with your cold call script. We put the customer example typically at the end of the cold call script. It fits really nicely here because your customer examples can really help to build interest. And the flow that we like to use for our cold call outline is to make the first half of the cold call more about the prospect and the second half about us. And so that's where the customer example goes. And a nice place to put it is right before the close. So the way this might work is you maybe ask a few questions, identify that the prospect might need or fit well with what you sell, and then you start to transition to go for the close. But before you do that, you might talk about your product a little bit. And then right after you talk about your product, you share an example of a customer you sold that to. And typically, this is a good place to use the long version, but you could also use your customer example at the beginning of the cold call as your cold call opener. And because you want to be a little tighter at the beginning, this is where you might want to use the short version of your customer example. And that might look something like this. Hey, Tom, the reason for the call is that we worked with SmileBright and helped them to increase their website traffic by 40%, ultimately leading to a 15% increase in new patients. I don't know if we can help you in that same way or not, and that's why I'm reaching out with a quick question. You can also use customer examples in your appointment script or your appointment outline. And again, we like to put this in the second half of the appointment because typically we like the first half of the appointment to be focused on the prospect by asking questions, and then we transition to how we might be able to help. And that's a really nice place to put the customer example. And again, you could probably use the long version when you're meeting with prospects and having an appointment. We can also use your customer example as a cold email message. And I'm not going to read through this email message, but if you can't tell, this is the short version of the customer example. You could probably use either, but I have a firm belief on minimizing the word count of emails, and using the short version is a good way to shorten the email. You can also use your customer example for a voicemail message, and that might look something like this. Hey, Tom, it's Michael Halper calling from Web Pros. We actually worked recently with SmileBright and helped them to increase this, and that ultimately led to an increase in that. I don't know if we can help you in the same way, and that's why I'm reaching out. You can also use your customer examples as responses to objections, and objections that these fit nicely with are objections where the prospect says, I can't afford your product or service, we don't have any budget right now, or you guys are too expensive. What those objections have in common is that the prospect is basically saying they do not see enough value in your product or service, meaning they feel like if they spend X dollars on what you sell, they're not going to get X dollars or more back in terms of value. And a good way to try to resolve that objection is by trying to explain or educate the prospect more on the value you have to offer. And a good way to do that is by sharing an example of another customer you've helped and the value you delivered to them. And the customer examples that we're helping you to create here do a good job of that. For example, let's say the prospect says, I can't afford what you're selling here today. You can respond to that by saying something like, oh, I understand. Real quick, we actually recently worked with a company called SmileBright, and we helped them to increase their website traffic by 40%, which ultimately led to an increase in new patients by 15%. If you could see an improvement like that, would that help you to justify investing in this area, or at least help you to justify spending more time talking about this? And so that response isn't guaranteed to work all of the time, but if the issue is that the prospect doesn't see value in what you sell, this does a pretty good job of educating them and helping them to see the value you have to offer. And if you haven't figured it out yet from all of these different videos, When you have these different building blocks, you can use them in a lot of different moments when talking with prospects. And that's actually how our software of SalesScripter works, in that there's an area called the Sales Message Builder that basically aligns with all of these steps I'm taking you through in these videos to create your sales message, and your sales message creates these different building blocks. And then there's an area of the software called the Sales Playbook, which is a library of scripts and templates and tools. And all of these documents basically mix and match those building blocks and put them in all of the different places where they fit. Pertaining to this video, here is a cold call script that opens with your customer example. And here is an email message that is created by the software that uses your customer example building block. And then we also provide email threads, which are series of emails that use all of your different building blocks. And in these email sequences, we typically use your customer example building block as email 3. And so your homework for this training module is to simply create one customer example, and that is pretty much it. In the next training module, we will talk about how to simplify and optimize the sales process you try to take prospects through. And if you aren't already aware, this full sales training program is already on YouTube. If you go to our channel, then go to playlists, and then go to the Smart Sales System, you will see videos for all of the different modules of this sales training program. And if you found this helpful in any way and want to return the favor, very easy for you to do. All you have to do is like, comment, share this video, subscribe to our channel. Any of those help us, and none of those cost you anything. And if you have questions or you want more information, the best place to go is salescripter.com. Thanks for being here. Hope this was helpful, and we look forward to seeing you on the next video. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.